Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch, the show that keeps a watch on Donald Trump, see what he's doing, reports back to you, and analyzes Trump's actions during the previous week. So let's start with Ukraine. Trump has stirred up all kinds of controversy over the fact that he is negotiating or talking to Vladimir Putin about ending the war between Ukraine and Russia. The controversy arises because he's excluding Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, in the talks, and he's excluding European countries and members of NATO in the talks, and he's dealing directly with Putin. Not to mention the fact that he's over there in a war of words with Zelensky, calling Zelensky an unelected dictator, and saying that he could have settled this conflict at the very beginning, and that he's responsible for having started the war. And boy, the right wing over here in the United States is up in arms. The mainstream press on the right wing is going after Trump for saying, "I dare you say these things," and going after him for befriending Russia or befriending Putin. This is a real no-no that you're not supposed to do. And the reasoning for all this is that the national security state of the United States, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, has always used Russia as its justification for existence. I mean, this was why the United States government was converted to a national security state in the first place. You know, we started out as a limited government republic. That is a totally different kind of governmental system. It's a governmental system where the government's powers are limited to those enumerated in the Constitution. And there was a small, relatively basic military force, but everybody understood that that military force fell under the executive branch and that its powers were just as limited as the rest of the federal government to the powers enumerated in the Constitution, and then were subject to the restrictions in the Bill of Rights. Once the government's converted to a national security state, which is a totally different type of governmental system, it's a totalitarian-like governmental system because now they're exercising omnipotent powers, including the powers of assassination, including assassinating American citizens, indefinite detention, no trials, no jury trials, torture, including torture of American citizens. In other words, everything changes with the conversion to a national security state. And from the very beginning, the rationale for this was Russia, that we have to convert America to this type of system to fight the Russians, who also were a national security state. They weren't subject to constitutional restrictions on dark side activities, and so we needed to match them in order to avoid America being taken over by the communists. And so this happens in the late 40s, and everything changes at this point. That you've got the whole Cold War, the Russians are coming, the communists are coming. Cuba later arises as a threat to national security, and everything revolves around national security. Nobody's ever defined the term national security, but all officials have to do is mention national security, and everybody has a conniption fit. Oh my gosh, national security, national security. It's the most meaningless but the most important term in the American political lexicon. And then there's intervention in North Korea. When North Korea invades South Korea, there's the Vietnam War. There's the whole Red Scare, the McCarthy hearings, going after people in Hollywood. There were communists everywhere. Everybody was being exhorted to look under their beds. And so to a certain extent, there was Red China involved in this, but the real boogeyman in this whole racket was Russia. And so the idea was Russia has to be made into the big premier official enemy of the United States. And so along comes John Kennedy. He comes into power as pretty much a standard Cold Warrior, not completely, but ultimately after the Bay of Pigs disaster and the national security establishment exhorting him to have a first strike nuclear attack on Russia, and then Operation Northwoods, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy finally achieves a remarkable breakthrough and realizes it's just a great big racket. That to justify the existence of the national security establishment and to justify the ever-increasing money that's flowing into this national security establishment, along with their army, ever-increasing army of of so-called defense contractors. So Kennedy says, we're going to move America in a completely different direction. So he starts to befriend Russia, and he goes on to American University and he delivers his famous peace speech, which just shocked the Russian people, because he's in there saying, okay, we have different ideologies, but we can get along. We don't need to have this permanent air of hostility and threat of nuclear war and so forth. And the Russian people loved it. They broadcast his speech all across the country. That had never happened before. And then Kennedy starts negotiating personally with Khrushchev, circumventing his entire national security establishment. Well, he became a threat to national security. The national security establishment believed that he was ridiculous to think that he could have peaceful coexistence with the communists. That was an impossibility in their mind. And that he was going to disarm, that America was going to end up like Cuba, under communist control. And that's the subject of FFF's book, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated. This was the motive. He was a threat to national security. It was the same motive that why Salvador Allende would get ousted as president of Chile 10 years later. He became a threat to national security of Chile, supposedly, as well as to the United States. So then, after Kennedy is assassinated, everything returns to normal. Russia is now the official enemy. The Vietnam War gets ramped up. Lyndon Johnson's on the same page as the national security establishment. 58,000 American men sacrificed for nothing. But at least the national security establishment still was in existence and still get a lot of money and a lot of power. And then suddenly, they lose their official enemy with the end of the Cold War. So they go to Saddam Hussein as a new official enemy. They go to terrorism after the 9/11 attacks, Islams, but they never give up on Russia, because Russia's the cash cow. And so they use NATO to keep expanding eastward. They told Russia that they would never do this at the end of the Cold War, because Russia figured, hey, we're going to get along now. We're going to have harmonious relations, but the Pentagon and the CIA were hell-bent on that never happening. So they used NATO to start absorbing the former members of the Warsaw Pact, and they finally get to Ukraine, and Russia's saying the whole time, if you threaten to absorb Ukraine into NATO, we're going to invade to stop this. And of course, so they induced the invasion by inviting Ukraine, or making waves that Ukraine's going to be part of NATO. And so when Biden says, oh, I predicted this, our intelligence showed that Russia was going to invade, this is pure nonsense. Russia said they were going to invade. It was the same thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Russia was putting its missiles in Cuba, it had the right to do that. Cuba is an independent nation. They could put their nuclear missiles there in their country if they wanted. But as a practical matter, everybody knew that the U.S. would invade to stop that from happening. And the Pentagon and the CIA were exhorting Kennedy to invade Cuba. And Kennedy struck a deal where Khrushchev withdraws the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise not to let the Pentagon and the CIA invade Cuba again. But if Khrushchev had said, no, we got a right to keep our missiles here, Kennedy would have invaded. And in that case, the U.S. mainstream press, assuming the war didn't destroy the world, would have said, oh, well, Russia started this war by putting their missiles there. But they can't see that same principle applying over here in Ukraine, that by provoking Russia into doing this, it was really the U.S. and Ukraine that ends up starting this war. The same thing that would have been said if Russia had maintained and steadfastly insisted on keeping its missiles in Cuba, and if the United States had invaded, they would have said, no, it was Russia that started the war by putting its missiles there. So Trump's over there trying to resolve this, and in the process trying to restore relations. And I read an interesting article about the Russian people, where the Russians are just really happy that this thing might be worked out. There's normalized relations, and American companies coming back in, and American tourists, and in other words, normal relations instead of this permanent, ongoing, never-ending, oh, the Russians are coming, they're reconstituting the Soviet Union, oh, they're going to build the Berlin Wall again, oh, they're going to conquer Western Europe and go into Latin America after defeating Great Britain and South America. I mean, it's just pure nonsense. But it's there, and so Trump's threatening this whole thing, I wrote an article wondering whether he's putting his life at risk, because this is why they took out Kennedy. But what he's doing is a good thing, but I don't see how he's going to settle it without getting out of NATO or getting rid of NATO or just walking away. I mean, that's what he ought to do, is bring all the troops home from Eastern Europe, from Germany. And World War II is over. Bring all the troops home. But if he leaves NATO in existence and he just tells Putin, I give you my word that we're not going to invite him. I'm going to nix any application by Ukraine, which is still insisting. Zelensky's still insisting on NATO membership, which of course would mean World War III. Under the infamous Article 5 there, which requires the U.S. to come to the defense of Ukraine in this war with Russia, which means nuclear war. But I don't see how you can resolve this war by keeping NATO in existence, because the U.S. breaks its word. So how can Russia count on Trump's word that says, well, we promise that if this war is, you just withdraw and we won't let Ukraine join NATO, we'll nix it, because it's got to be unanimous. Well, what happens if Trump happens to die of a heart attack tomorrow? How can Putin be guaranteed that the next president, Vance, won't take a different position? Or 4 years from now, a new president? And you can't trust the U.S. as the Russians have learned. I mean, the U.S. promised them that NATO would not move eastward, and that's exactly what they did. So you can't trust them. So the only way this thing, to me, can be resolved to Russia's satisfaction, where it's clear that it's not going to have to worry about this, is just get rid of NATO. It's a World War II dinosaur. It's the root cause of the whole crisis here. But I don't see Trump moving in that direction. I could be wrong, but he could. I mean, I know NATO's by treaty and stuff, but he could start withdrawing troops from Western Europe and saying, well, we're not interested in being part of this anymore. So he's doing that with USAID. He's doing it with the Department of Education. He's not formally abolishing them, but he's decimating them in terms of firing people and all this. So let's segue into that area. From a libertarian standpoint, this is great. I mean, the USAID is just a front for the CIA. Now, predictably, the mainstream press is all up in arms. Oh, think about all the people that are dying, the poor, and, he's terminating foreign aid. And this is all just a ruse. It's a clever ruse by the CIA to mask its dark side activities behind a front of foreign aid to the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. So that if you dismantle this agency, you hate the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. That's the argument. It's a standard welfare state argument. You want to abolish any welfare state argument, that's proof that you hate the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. And then they're worried about, the U.S. government, that how's it going to be helping the poor? There's this concept that the U.S. government has a soul, like a political soul, that it might not go to heaven if it's not helping the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, or that the various agencies might have individual political souls, where they go to, agency department heaven. The USAID now won't be able to go to heaven because it's not helping the poor, needy, and disadvantaged. Well, this is a great thing that Trump's doing. He's decimating, he's exposing this horrific thing. Now, they say, well, he's saving money. Well, I'm not convinced of that yet. Sure, he's saving a few bucks here and a few bucks there, but he's tinkering. I mean, in the larger scheme of things, he's tinkering. I mean, he's trying to lower taxes too, and he's fired a bunch of IRS agents. But remember that the argument of lowering taxes is, people will work harder, and therefore more revenues into the government. That's not necessarily the case, because people know that what really matters is the amount of expenditures. And when you've got the massive welfare state, consisting in large part of Social Security and Medicare, which nobody wants to touch, and then all the other welfare programs, remember, education grants, farm subsidies, the whole kit and caboodle of welfare state programs, all the departments, the regulated society, the SEC, the Department of Labor, OSHA and all that stuff, and then the big one, the national security state, which Trump isn't going to touch because the national security state enforces his border down there. They're just tinkering over here. And how much money is he spending in this war on immigrants? He's building this huge, edifice there at Guantanamo to house migrants. How much is that going to cost? How about all these flights and the militarization of the border? So what's going to be interesting to see is, on balance, did he save any money here? Okay, he saved money over here by terminating USAID or some foreign aid programs, but if he spends a lot more over here, what difference does it make? And so I'm not really convinced that this tinkering, and what I've said before is that the problem isn't Trump, okay? The show is called Trump Watch, but really it ought to be called Welfare Warfare State Watch, because it's the system that Americans need to reevaluate. The welfare state system that came into existence in the 1930s, the national security state system that came into existence in the 1940s. These have been the great destroyers of our freedom. And this is where Americans need to do some soul searching, is that you got a bad system. $36 trillion in debt and climbing. That doesn't even include Social Security, Medicare, the so-called entitlement programs. Those obligations are on top of the $36 trillion. And then I read that the interest on the debt now exceeds the military's expenditures. That's incredible. So they're just paying the debt. I mean, the risk is an internal cave-in. And you can't ever predict when something like that's going to happen, but you can predict that it's going to happen at some point. I mean, we've seen that happen throughout history, that governments spend themselves into bankruptcy. And that's why we need to do some serious soul searching in this country as to whether we want to continue with this system or restore America's founding system of a limited government republic and a free market system, and one based totally on voluntary charity. As I've said before, my model that we would build on is in the late 1800s, a so-called Gilded Age that the statists hate so much. No income tax, no Social Security, no Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, paper money, central bank, Federal Reserve, virtually no immigration controls. They had some controls, but they let in most people. And then free trade, that's another necessary aspect of this. Of a free society, and then we build on those principles. Now, Trump's, not there. He's over here, to me, tinkering with trying to make the welfare warfare state work, which every president tries to do. It can't work. Now, Trump's also going off on the war on drugs. Okay, he's doubling down on the war on drugs. How much is that costing? He's now converting the war on drugs into the war on terrorism. He's morphing the two so that he can use the military to win the war on drugs here in the United States. Now, the military's already been embroiled in the war on drugs in foreign countries, which is kind of ironic because we've made it illegal for the military to get involved in the war on drugs here, but it's okay for them to get involved in the war on drugs in other countries. But now he's changed that because he's morphing the war on drugs with the war on terrorism, which means the military can get involved. And it turns out the military's already in Mexico with drone flights, looking for fentanyl labs and so forth. And they're threatening to bomb the terrorists. So that there's always that possibility of a war with Mexico, which might mean that we, in the peace treaties, do what we did in the 1800s when we went to war with Mexico, absorb the entire northern half of what's left. We stole the northern half of Mexico. We made it part of the United States, and then complain about all the Mexican culture over here after you steal the entire northern half of a foreign country. But we could do it again, steal the northern half of what's left of the southern half, and so you've got all that. Now, you see, it's ironic because, libertarians make a big deal. Oh, Donald Trump freed Ross Ulbricht. Well, great. But that's just one person. But it was clear it's just a political favor because it wasn't like Trump had this big revelation about the evils of the drug war. You don't see him pardoning all the other people. There's a lot of Ross Ulbrichts in jail. And unfortunately, some libertarians say, well, we don't need to worry about those, Jacob. We got Ross Ulbricht. He was the libertarian. As long as we got the libertarian out of there, nonsense. That we can't let up. And that's the trouble sometimes with making a bargain with the devil, is that you can't criticize the devil after you've made a bargain with him. But he needs to be criticized because doubling down on the war on drugs is just further destruction of our freedom. And that's really what this is all about. The national security state destroyed our freedom. Now notice I don't say is destroying our freedom. It destroyed our freedom. We lost our freedom with the national security state because this is omnipotent government. There's just no question about it. When you've got the power to assassinate a citizenry or indefinitely detain a citizenry without trial, without due process of law, torture people, that is not a free society, even if they're not exercising the power. Because all they have to do is declare a national emergency, and they've got the power right there, and it's been upheld by the courts, so the federal courts. And then you've got the whole welfare state mentality, and so you've got a society that is not free. And then now you've got the whole war on drugs as part of all this thing, which has really destroyed civil liberties. And now that they're converting it into a wartime situation, I mean, you're going to see a greater destruction of our freedom. And you've got, unfortunately, a lot of people cheering this on. Oh, isn't he doing a great job to destroy our freedom? It's sort of like, the frog business of how you boil a frog. You don't throw them into a vat of boiling water. You put them in the water, and then you start turning up the heat, and that's what they've done. And you can see this with the war on immigrants. I've pointed this out over time, the decades, they've converted the borderlands into a police state with every reform they have to crack down that we're going to win this thing, and they never repeal their police state measures when they don't work. They just say, oh, well, we need to add another one. And add another one, and add another one. And the latest one is militarize the border. Send the military down there. Wait, you can't be living in a free society when you live under a militarized police state. Even when you convince yourself that you're free, and that's probably the problem that Americans have, is that they've convinced themselves that they're living in a free society. And well, they've been convinced of it too. That's what the indoctrination in the government schools is all about. The Pledge of Allegiance for liberty and justice for all, and you believe it, and you go to your deathbed as an adult believing this. Trump's even appointed an ex-CIA official. Now here, again, we heard all the talk in the campaign: drain the swamp, drain the swamp. He's going to go after the deep state. The deep state is the national security state. That is the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA with their secret surveillance schemes and everything. And Trump's already making nice with the CIA. He appointed a former CIA officer as ambassador to Mexico. I mean, the war on terrorism and the war on drugs and the war on immigrants. So you've got this massive state taking place here while Trump's over here saying, but look what I'm doing with the USAID and foreign aid and so forth, which is all good, but it's a distraction because over here, he's consolidating power that involves the destruction of the freedom and well-being of the American people. And Americans, they just keep buying into all this. They're terribly afraid. It's so ironic that we live under the most powerful government in history. I mean, there's never been a government with a military and a CIA and an NSA, a giant military intelligence establishment as powerful as this. And the irony is Americans are the most frightened, scared people in the world. Americans are scared of everything. They're scared of the Russians. They're scared of Putin. They're scared of the North Koreans, Iran. They're scared of the drug dealers, the Muslims, the terrorists, the illegal immigrants, and they're convinced that they're all coming to get them. I mean, I have one guy who's a big Trumpster writes me periodically and says that he's convinced that the illegal immigrants are a front to take over the United States. That they're an invasion, like Trump says, they're an invasion to take over the United States. Well, they're carrying their babies in their arms instead of AR-15s. But people really believe this, and they're scared. And then they're gonna come and get me, Jacob. One guy recently told me, I hope you have guns, Jacob. I mean, it's like I have this vision where people are living in their basements with their door locked and getting their groceries delivered, but making sure that the groceries are just dropped off because it could be an invader coming to take them over. This is ridiculous. When you see a country that's living under this much fear, that's not a free country. And clearly the immigrants are living in tremendous fear with this deportation that's going on. It's just horrendous. They're taking people from other countries now, from China and India and parts in Asia, and they're just shipping them and dumping them in Panama or Costa Rica. And what's happening is that Trump has that implicit threat, if it's not explicit, saying, if you don't take these people when we dump them on you, we'll impose tariffs on you. And it's like one guy from Costa Rica said, man, we can't handle the tariffs. We're too small a country. He would destroy us with tariffs. And so this is how an empire works. It's got its colonies. And the colonies are all these nations that are dependent on the dole, on the foreign aid dole, or are dependent on not having tariffs imposed on them. So when he says, I'm going to dump these people on you, yes, Mr. President, please send them, send more. And there's the news media is reporting that some of these immigrants are put into these hotels and locked. They lock the door. One lady, I think she was an Iranian immigrant, she wrote on the window, "Help," with lipstick. Like they're prisoners. They're locked up. They don't know what to do. The regimes there don't know what to do. It's just total chaos. It's just total chaos, this immigration control system. And I've been saying that for almost all my life. I grew up on the border, and I've seen this chaos year after year, decade after decade. It never stops. I should mention that who was it? The Washington Post, I believe, had a fantastic article yesterday or this week about my hometown of Laredo, Texas. It's in our FFF Daily for Monday. Take a look at it. It's really worth reading. I've talked about how Laredo had celebrates George Washington's birthday. I think we're the only city in the United States that ever has done that, but in a big way. Parade downtown with Pocahontas leading the parade on horseback, and floats, and debutantes there, and a great big debutantes ball, and a jalapeno festival that I'm sure George Washington would have been very pleased with. And this has been going on for decades. My grandfather actually helped start it there in Laredo. But the article pointed out that from when I was a kid, from 57 to 75 or 76, there was an open border between Nuevo Laredo and Laredo. It was amazing that everybody would stand down. I don't know how they pulled it off with the Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs there at the bridge, but they would just stand down. Open borders. Anybody could come over into Laredo. And it was interesting that the article pointed this out, and the ties that exist between both sides, because remember, Laredo had been part of Mexico. You see, it was always part of the Mexican Republic, and before that the Spanish Empire. And so there's this connection that still exists after all these years between Nuevo Laredoans and Laredoans. So Nuevo Laredoans would just come over. America did not fall into the ocean. Okay, Laredo did not plummet into the Rio Grande. In other words, it worked. It was a system of open borders for a relatively short period of time, maybe 4 or 5 days, where everybody from Nuevo Laredo or anybody from Mexico could come over. Now, did the whole world come? People say, oh, if we open the borders, the whole world would come. Well, we had open borders. The whole world did not come. Okay, the whole of Mexico did not come. Most of the people that came were just from Nuevo Laredo. They would cross the bridge and they'd participate in all the festivities, and some of them might have stayed. But back then it was relatively easy for Nuevo Laredoans to come over into Laredo. I don't know how they did it, but they'd have a special tourist visa or something like that. It wasn't totally legal, though, because I know a lot of the housewives had maids that were illegal, and the gardeners were oftentimes illegal, but there was an unwritten rule that Border Patrol would not enforce border controls on people in Laredo, unless a maid would get mad at an abusive housewife and move, and the housewife would learn where she was now working and would report her in retaliation. Then the Border Patrol would act, because they would have to act. But otherwise, there was this unwritten rule that the Border Patrol would leave Laredo housewives alone, and they would hire maids and gardeners and nannies and so forth. But the point I wanted to make is that I've said this for decades, the current system does not work. It will never work. It's an inherently defective system. Okay? It creates chaos. It is planned chaos. The only thing that works is open borders, just like we have here domestically. Everybody's a proponent of open borders. Not everybody, but most people are proponent of open borders here domestically. You know, people cross over from Maryland every day. Hundreds of thousands of people come into Virginia every day. Nobody keeps track of them. Nobody monitors them. There are murderers, rapists, thieves, Muslims, Jews, Catholics, illegal immigrants, drug dealers, terrorists, whatever. But nobody wants to give up, or few people want to give up. Most everybody does not want to give up their system of open borders. And I keep saying that that's the only system that creates a harmony between peoples of other nations, just like it creates a harmony between people of different states. And then movements become normal. You don't pay attention to them anymore. All the chaos disappears. The whole border control chaos would be over overnight. By the way, the same thing with the war on drugs. You want to get rid of the cartels? You don't bomb them like Trump's threatening to do. You don't have drones spying on people in foreign countries. You don't start wars over the war on drugs. You don't convert it into war on terrorism. Just legalize drugs. And then the whole thing's over. The cartels go out of business overnight. And the only reason I think they can't see this is because they won't let themselves see it. Because of the whole bureaucracy that has come into existence, a bureaucracy that Trump continues to support with the drug war and the national security state. He's ramping up the war on terrorism now, the militarization of the border. It's no way to live. And it's time for Americans to do some serious soul searching here. Not on who should be president, but on what kind of system do you want for the rest of your life and for the lives of your children and your grandchildren. You like this system? Great. Continue it. But don't be surprised if it leads to national bankruptcy and big economic crises and then crackdowns on financial liberties and money laundering laws and bank secrecy laws and all that destructive state of nonsense. The real solution is in this soul searching is let's look at the good principles on which our nation was founded. We know there were some bad ones like slavery, but let's look at the good ones and let's restore those good ones, along with free markets and voluntary charity and a limited government republic instead of a national security state. And that's when we start getting America back on the right road, the road to freedom and peace, prosperity, and harmony with the people of the world. That's Trump Watch for this week. I look forward to talking to you all next week.